As the role of the Catholic Church in Irish life declines, questions are being asked as to whether it is still appropriate for the Church to control 90% of the country's 3,200 primary schools. In the coming weeks, a government report arising out of a forum on patronage and pluralism in primary schools will recommend how we might best create a school patronage system that reflects an increasingly diverse society. Now, this got us wondering about how the Church came to run the majority of our schools for so long and how this has shaped society through the generations. I'm joined by Brendan Walsh, who's a lecturer in the history of education at Dublin City University, Niamh Harrigan, who's a sociologist with University College Cork, and Joe O'Toole, former teacher, senator and president of the Irish National Teachers Organisation, and Minister Rory Quinn is still with us. Brendan, can we go right back to the beginning of the Church involvement in education in Ireland and the first formal relationship that it had with the education system? 1831, is that our starting point?
Well, it is in one way. 1831 is the start of the, as the Minister was pointing out earlier on, we're nearly at the anniversary of the so-called Stanley Letter, which established the national school system in Ireland in 1831. And then our intermediate or secondary school system followed in 1878. 1831, there was a lot of religious involvement in schools before that, and in fact the Stanley Letter was an attempt to create a pluralist. It's interesting in the last debate about how we establish a pluralist or non-religious run education system. This is as old as the hills. Really, the reason in 1831 you get an attempt by the government of the day to try and establish a system that is available to Protestants and Catholics and Presbyterians on an equal footing. It's state funded, and it's funded by this payment by results system that all historians of education know about. That had repercussions as well. And that system, it never became multi-denominational, partly demographically, because the Protestant cohort was so small at a local school in a village and such would be predominantly Catholic. But it was operated on the basis of no religious iconography and so on and so forth. It was inspected on a yearly basis. So it was the first attempt. It failed in the sense that by 1900 the bishop said that the schooling was as denominational as they could wish.
And did Westminster play ball?
Oh yeah, I mean, in fact, one of the there's a famous book written in 1902 where called and he talks about, the author O'Donnell talks about the accommodating Protestants in Westminster, who essentially were quite happy to cooperate with the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland on running the schools on that basis. And really, it was a micro thing. Macro level, you had schools that were supposedly non-denominational. On a micro level, you had business as usual, and schools being run largely by Catholics or Protestants, depending on where the region was. And that continued right up. I mean, in the sense we're talking about, it's continuing now. But it continued on the basis of feet on the ground in schools up to the 1950s and 1960s, where lay teachers were assistant masters and assistant mistresses and didn't have a foothold in schools at all, and had to fight hard through the ASTI. So, but the one thing I would say in relation to this is that there is, before that, involvement of proselytising societies and so on. So you had a long sort of penal memory in Catholic Ireland that was very insistent on getting a foothold in schools.
I think, Niamh, that memory is still very, very strong at the foundation of the state in the early 1920s as well. And when you see how that played out and how far the Church went in terms of control and what the state allowed, I suppose, can that be said to have contributed to a particular type of culture based on deference and based on authoritarian structures?
I think it definitely did. And I mean, it's been highlighted recently in reports like Nyberg and Regling and Watson, who've all highlighted...
These are the reports into the economic crisis.
These are reports into the economic crisis, and they've all problematized the culture of deference and kind of said, well, where has this come from? This is, they're essentially saying this is rather unusual. I think, if we go back to people like Basil Chubb, who, again, looking at kind of political structures in Ireland, have again highlighted, the role in which Catholicism... Now, it's very important, I think, to view Catholicism as part of a mosaic here.
Yeah, it's too simplistic,
there was
as opposed to
economic
isolate.
structures going on. There was, in many cases, a kind of family business structure, which I think also our family farm, which very much... supported kind of authoritarianism and patriarchal structures. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church did play a ball there. And, I think that, in a sense, is something that has to be looked at in the contemporary context.
And did the state have options there in 1922 and 1923 that it didn't go for?
I suppose my view is that it did. I mean, I think if we look at the if you look at the 19th century history around education, you see this continual aspiration to create mixed education models, which are thwarted, frustrated, don't happen for one reason or another, despite lots of well-meaning attempts. When you look at the foundation of the state, this is the system which the state inherits. They have options as to how far they go and what reforms they make. I mean, there was a potential for radicalism there if you look what they did around the Irish language. It's not that they weren't, the founding fathers of the state weren't afraid to get their hands dirty and change education. But I think that if you look at this very hands-off, almost remote structure, which acknowledges kind of the secondary role of the state in running schools, they didn't necessarily have to go for that.
How important was that, Joe?
Well, I think just to ask the question in terms of the options, the options began actually before the foundation of the state, maybe 1919, the Macpherson Bill, which showed broad-minded progressive people, mainly Protestants, in charge of Irish education, and English people wanting to open up, do something like Minister Rory Quinn is trying to do at the moment, opening up the patronage of schools and the ownership of schools by establishing an Irish Department of Education, which the Catholic Church simply said no way, because they were going to lose control to some people who lived in Marlborough Street or wherever the function was. At that time, my old alma mater, the INTO, took a very strong line in favour of the Macpherson Bill, which would have opened up education, a more comprehensive system, more locally based, local involvement, and properly run. And at that stage, the then president of the INTO, a man called T.J. Noonan, was absolutely vilified by every single one of the bishops in the country, by preaching, letters to newspapers, and by the hierarchy in general. And it's interesting, like 100 years later, almost, the current minister is trying to do something similar. And that man's granddaughter is now Sheila Noonan, the Secretary General of the INTO, which I think is a nice sort of historical reference there. So they did have the operation. There's a very strong body of thought which would indicate that Dev and others did not even want a Department of Education, Department of Education and a Ministry of Education when they set up the new state. His preference was for Department of Gaeilge. And he was moved forward. So
they were seen as one and the same thing.
Yeah, and then when it came to the, I suppose, and when the Macpherson Bill came to the House of Commons and supporting the point made by Brendan, the Irish Party just pulled away from it. Only 4 of them stayed in the chamber, and the 4 of them spoke against the bill, which was for the good of Ireland. But that was the part of the bishops. And 10 years later, or whatever, bit more, when we came to putting forward our constitution, the constitution was vetted by the Upton Archbishop's House time and time again. Every single line of it was done.
Come on now, don't be exaggerating.
Well, in terms of, I said on the way in, I said I'd give you one beautiful part of it, and it's the bit in the text which says that.
Did you say a beautiful part of the Constitution?
Yes, it's a beautiful part of it. That the religious, moral, and intellectual, physical, and social education of children had to be sorted. They had a right to religious, moral, intellectual, physical, and social. And then when it goes on to say, the state shall, in view of actual conditions, ensure that that the children receive a certain minimum education, but this time it's only moral, intellectual, and social. Obviously, religion didn't enter into it, but physical and was what they saw by issues like, could we talk about things like sex education? Could we talk about things like anything to do with the body? That was not the business. That was a direct intervention by the Catholic Church. So that goes all the way through, and the Trinity NUI continued all through that single period, and it continued right the way down to, I think, even current legislation.
We'll come back to that in a moment. Rory, part of the narrative here, of course, is about power and control and who's pulling the strings. But there's also the question of generations of children who would never have received an education if it wasn't for the Catholic Church. Is there a danger, I suppose, given everything that's happened in the last 15 or 20 years in relation to the Church, that there might be an element of balance lost in how we portray it?
I think that balance has been lost. I received a wonderful education from the teaching order of the Holy Ghost Fathers, and I've always publicly referred to it. And an awful lot of people were enabled to afford to go to school because Christian brothers pooled their salaries and combined their income. They were qualified teachers and lived together and subsidised. The state got an education system on the cheap, but it has all changed now. I think from my reading of Johnny Coulihan's book and the other stuff around the period of independence in 1921-22, there was one big nationalist project, and that was to use the education system to convert this country from English-speaking to Irish-speaking. Mm-hmm. And like any sensible politician, they just come through a civil war. They weren't about to take on a second front. And anyway, there was no desire for it. What we're looking at in the context of today is a very different configuration on the ground. But the Church, look, anybody that has a collective power and the Catholic Church in many countries was doing the same thing, was exercising their power in what they saw was in the best interests of society.
And there was self-interest there as well, obviously.
The medieval church was in the business of education and hospital care and care for the elderly long before any state saw it was remotely their business to so do.
Yeah.
But I think the key question is not so much, the extent of church involvement in state education, because it was extensive. The key question is, what was the trade? What did the church get as a consequence of that, and its kind of cultural hold on people? And if you look at the debate now around school patronage, and I suppose the tensions within that debate and the resistances in that debate, because we're looking at a scenario now where we have actually very few religious teaching in schools, but we still have a very strong role for religious in managing schools, and a very strong role for religious in managing colleges of education, which I think is even more important. And within that debate, this question of the trade is critical.
And isn't class critical in that as well? And you alluded to, Rory, in the context of what people could afford. But when you consider the religious orders, and the class divides that they represented, I suppose you could argue. There was a quip in 1932, for example, when the change of government came, when Fianna Fáil came into power, that the Christian Brothers educated boys were taking over from Cumann Gael, the Jesuit educated boys, and there was an element of truth in that. But how important was that class dimension?
Well, it's fascinating because, historically, of course, you have this great tradition of denial of class in Ireland, that particularly the middle class don't tend to identify themselves as middle class. But in the kind of memory narrative stuff that I've been doing at the moment, I interviewed a guy last week who was talking about going to play a match in the 1950s at a Jesuit boarding school here in Dublin, and he was coming from a CBS school in the west of Ireland, in West Clare. And he describes not being able to get over watching the priests chatting and joking with the other students in this particular boarding school compared to the relations between the brothers. And he was almost saying that my class consciousness, my perception of myself in the social structure of Irish society at that time was formed so much by my interaction with religious. And likewise, these guys who had a much more privileged position, their sense of themselves was being formed too. And I think, we do have to look at the church's role in reproducing the existing class structure rather than breaking it down. And if we look at investment in education as being one of the key factors in blowing that apart to a certain extent, that came from the OECD, and that was very firmly in a kind of secular, rational tradition.
And it underlines the degree to which the 1960s was a crucial decade, Brendan, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
I mean, what in effect was the investment in education report in 1965 saying? Before
answering that, can I just pick up on some of the things Niamh is saying? I think I agree with almost everything she's saying, but I do think from the point of view, there's a sociological analysis and a historical analysis, and I think that there can be there's two ways of looking at it in one sense, which is when we talk about the Church in Ireland in the 1950s, within the context of the society that's Ireland in the 1950s, they're very much the same thing. In other words, people in collars are just as prey to the social consensus and weaknesses and faults and pride and all the rest of it that everybody else is. And I mean, I've been, it's really interesting to hear about interviewing people. I've been doing likewise, and particularly around when you talk to, for example, women who've been teaching now, maybe in their 70s, have retired, and talk to them about the marriage ban and so on and so forth. They just simply say, "Look, that's the way it was. Nothing. We didn't." And that's why I can come to the 60s for you. That's the way it was until society changed. So. And when you read the history of the schools and so on...
They were still angry about it at the time.
Well, the INTO in particular were, absolutely.
Were very
but there is, I mean, I think...
And I think understanding the reasons why it was the way it was is critical in terms of how we move forward, particularly now in the context of the school patronage.
But I think actually the historical debate around the church involvement in education and the present debate around patronage are actually separate in a sense, because the Ireland that we're talking about at that period, by and large, doesn't exist anymore. And we can't be fair to the past unless we try and empathise.
But there's no doubt that the church was getting nervous in the 1960s.
Oh, no question, because I was going to come to investment education, because in the 60s everything changes. There's no question about that, and rightly so, I would argue, because particularly from the point of view, and I've a vested interest in this, of having taught myself for a long time, lay teachers couldn't get a foot in the schools at all. They had nowhere near management, they had no rights, they had no salaries, they didn't have contracts of employment, because the religious that I've spoken to will admit it almost never occurred to them. That's a simplistic way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is they had a lot of buildings, they had a lot of money in those buildings, they had a very powerful organisation in the country. They were recruiting kids into the seminaries. I've talked to people who were in school in the 60s, and they'll say even at that time half of their classmates went into the seminaries.
But I don't think the debate about the kind of role of the church in class formation is completely remote today, because if we look at the debate around fee-paying schools at the moment and whether they should be continuing to receive their grant, and a lot of those fee-paying schools are run by religious orders
There's
or
no
different
doubt that these
denominations.
issues are still
And that's
relevant.
still issues
But they
there.
themselves- the religious orders themselves.
We have a text that's come in here, and you can text us on 51551. But here's one. I work in a community school, and the Catholic Church still has a major influence. Don't be fooled into thinking that it's only in voluntary schools. Secular atheist teachers are meant to be invisible.
That's right, and the reality is as well that even when you began this element of the discussion about would there what the great contribution that the Christian Brothers and others made, which they did, but a lot of people kind of take this as a kind of a statement on its own. The reality is the buildings they had and they got through the pennies and shillings of people with of very low or no income. So it's not as if to say like that they presented something to the state. They did a great job. There's no question about that in terms of a vacuum. But it is, I firmly believe, a vacuum that were it not filled by the churches, it would have been filled by the state. And the whole question of proselytization is no different. I don't blame the churches for doing it, but they did do it. But it's no different to the point that Minister Gwenda Rory said earlier, that people think they can solve every problem in society in the classrooms or in the curriculum. Like people see schools and education as a method of social engineering. I certainly know in my first year at college, in College of Education, our Professor Jordan, that's Neil Jordan's dad, he gave us in consecutive weeks the gymnasium system of education in Germany.
This is when he was teaching PE.
The communist system, exactly. The communist system and the apartheid system and Pierce's murder machine. He gave us those four weeks in a row. I tell you something, for a 17-year-old, it just simply.
But that's a very interesting point, Joe, because you were there in the 1960s, very young. You were in St. Patrick's training college, an all-male environment. Some people have suggested that it really was just a seminary under the guise of being a teacher training college.
It was certainly...
Were you always trying to escape?
It was certainly... I was just on the changeover period, and another man called Deferter with me, whom you know quite well. And at that period, they were just moving from the totally controlled, oppressive system that was there through the early 60s, and then it changed. And we were actually the bridge period, where we were kind of let out at night. You could kind of go down O'Connell Street, you could go down and meet, you could have a drink.
Well, could you meet the girls in Carysford?
You could meet the girls in Carysford, but you dare not bring them back to the college. Not that we would ever think of doing
because
anything.
a lot of the women who were in Mary I would have made the point that they felt they were in a convent.
But it wasn't. Yeah. It was certainly like that. And if you recall, in the 60s, or is it the late 60s, early 70s, that they had the Carysford Revolution, because they were still about 10 years behind, say, what was happening in Drumcondra. Drumcondra saw some change taking place. It was actually with the new buildings. It's amazing what architecture can do, really. Build new buildings and people suddenly get a new vision.
It is interesting to look at the colleges of education in terms of the current debates and the role of religious still in managing and in the senior
and as role models, maybe.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I was based in a college of education for myself for a number of years, and there were excellent role models amongst the religious, particularly for women.
If you were a non-Catholic, if you were non-Christian, you couldn't possibly become an Irish trained primary teacher in the 60s or even the 70s. I mean, that's the reality.
But Joe, I think the problem is that...
Look at what happened to McGahern.
If we look today at the current... I mean, current undergraduates in colleges of education are told that the certificate in religious education is optional. And nevertheless, if you're a teacher who's trying to apply for a permanent job in one of the 90% of Catholic-controlled secondary schools in Ireland, you can't do it without the certificate in religious education. And we're not in the 1960s anymore.
And in relation to the 1960s, and Rory, be particularly interested in what you think of this. Donogh O'Malley's bombshell in 1966. I'm introducing free secondary education, and to hell with the Department of Finance and what it might think. Is that still the benchmark? Would you still be very conscious of that as current minister?
Oh, it was critical, and in fact the person who unleashed Donogh O'Malley was Lamass, who more or less gave him the nod to go ahead and do it. Sean O'Connor, the former head of the department, wrote in his Troubled Sky the history of the various ministers for education. While O'Malley died after a very short period of time, he was less than 2 years in the department. It followed directly on the OECD-inspired investment in education.
And Patrick Hillary and George Colley, who we should give credit to as well.
And Hillary, certainly in John Walsh's biography of Patrick Hillary, it's very clear that Hillary came in quite cautiously from his West Clare constituency, but very soon was persuaded by the arguments of the radical civil servants who actually drove reform in the Department.
Who often don't get the mention that they deserve.
No. And I suspect that there was a latent, and this is purely suspicion on my part, there was a latent kind of resentment that here they were providing the resources, doing all the sort of things, doing the curriculum, the rest of it, and yet they had to bow the knee as they saw it to. I mean, the wonderful building designed by Richard Castles, which is now where Marlborough Street is, and my office, I got a note from a friend of mine when I went into the department. He said he referred to Styra na Hospice, the staircase of the bishops, because, mind you, I would have thought that the minister should have been walking up to the bishops on the other way around. But the radicalism of those
to heaven, was it?
The radicalism of Sean O'Connor and others, clearly, and it's very clear in Walsh's book, that Hillary, unlike O'Malley, didn't initiate anything. He responded to proposals that came to him, but he had the courage and the political leadership to steer them through. And
he was once described as quietly explosive in relation to this issue.
And like, as well as that, I think it's clear that Lamass dealt directly with Donald O'Malley in that issue. The Department of Finance were sidelined.
And also the series of appointments that Lamass made as Minister for Education in the 60s is really interesting and shows a real flair.
If you think of that generation again, and Brenda, be interested to know what you think of this. A lot of politicians, obviously from what were church-run schools, many of them still are they the best people to be making decisions on patronage?
Gosh, I don't know the answer to that question, Dermot. I really don't. I mean, you have to trust people are elected as a representative. They have to make decisions guided by their own lights. I'm not sure post-60s. I mean, I think some of the schools we're talking about as Catholic or Protestant schools and so on. I mean, I spend a lot of time in schools, and the extent to which they're actually Catholic or so on and so forth is questionable in the sense that their ethos. I mean, officially they're Catholic, but to what extent that permeates through. I know Niamh would, and I think what Niamh said earlier on is really interesting about the training colleges, because the history of those is the same thing. Let's not have non-denominational training colleges. Let's set up St Angela's and so on, Carysford and so on, and they were run like convents and they were very restrictive and so on part of the time, and it was the 60s that flushed this all out. And in fact, the research that I'm doing, the 60s is I mean, I wasn't there for the 60s, so I'm only going on second-hand information, but there are a whole number of social phenomena that come together at the same time, and the church has to respond to them. And when you're talking about free education, I mean, the Dominicans, for example, decide, no, we're pulling out of it. We're going to go for free education and so on. Other orders, I think, become more entrenched and say, no, we're suspicious of this. So when we talk about church involvement in education, in fact, there's no such thing.
I think that issue of ethos is absolutely critical.
How do you define ethos?
Because that's the whole problem, essentially, and I think it's going to become even more pressing as the school patronage debate evolves.
Well, I'll tell you something now. I can tell you something. When that piece of legislation is going through, the Education Act, I put down 4 different amendments. And I also got in the Shannon, and I got it done also in the Dáil.
The 1998 Act.
Yes, to define ethos or ethos. Instead of an ethos,
and
we have
it's like trying to
the classical
grab air.
There's 4,000. The ethos is determined by the individual school in the
but also,
in the way it's written in
fairness,
the Act
just to refer back to Brendan's point about the extent to which schools are or are not religious is debatable, and I would agree there is a sliding scale there. But there are, I mean, for Catholic managed schools, there are certain points, particularly in the primary school curriculum, where it is. I mean, second class is dominant. I have a child of that age myself. It's dominated by First Communion. Now, it's very interesting if you look at the recent research done by Lynch and Lodge, which looks at what happens to kids of other denominations during second class, and most of the time they either sit in the class and participate, or they sit in the class and they don't participate. And how does that intersect with ethos and pastoral care? These are the issues that.
Well, in relation to ethos or overall ethos, even though it might be difficult to define it, we have a question here from a listener. And there's a prize for whoever can answer this. How different would we be as a nation if we had adopted a secular school system in 1922? Well, I mean, you're gone very quiet now.
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, in 1922, the Irish Catholic hierarchy sent out a statement which says that the only satisfactory system of education is Catholic children taught in Catholic schools by Catholic teachers under Catholic control. That was the starting off point at that stage, and that's what ran all the way through. Like, I certainly think that a good teacher is a good teacher, whether he or she happens to be Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, or whatever he happens to be. And I would say certainly, I got my education, Christian Brothers in Dingle. We were taught to challenge, to argue, to debate in Irish and in English on everything, even on matters of faith, matters of religion. religion. Maybe that was unusual for a Christian Brothers school, but that's certainly, like in answer to the earlier question, are people like that who come from these schools, can they walk away from it? They can. And in terms of the issue of First Holy Communion, etc., and I feel very strongly about this, whether it be Bar Mitzvah or First Communion, these are cultural things. They've got damn all to do with religion. If you go to your first meeting of the child in it and check how many people who are all committed to religion this year were at Mass last Sunday, for instance, you'll find the numbers very few. It is a cultural issue.
Dermot, you know, having a secular school system, people tend to sometimes equate that with necessarily having a very tolerant, inclusive school system. And if we look at the French model, that's not necessarally the case. And I think it's very important that there isn't too much slippage there about having space for faith and other practices as well. So, and that's going to have to be part of our debate.
Now, for all of the talk about who controls and power, what about teachers themselves, Brendan? We're very interested in this project. You're writing an oral history of secondary school teaching here since 1922, and you've been talking to retired teachers about their experiences. And I just want to give you a quick taste of what they had to say.
At the time, there were very few careers open to women. Women couldn't go into pubs. It was a totally different world. So your lifestyle and your choices and the perceived areas women could function in were very limited. But teaching was a positive choice. It wasn't by default. I wanted to do it.
It wasn't a difficult school, but I felt disadvantaged because I was young and female. The very first day in the classroom, I had to leave to get sick because of the nerves. I was perspiring and excused myself and went outside and vomited on the corridor.
Discipline, the stick, a lot of rumbling type of violence. The ones who suffered it were the weak, the impoverished, the sons of people who would never turn up and say, "What are you doing?" Could be for anything, and it could be at any moment. They knew their guardians would never turn up to complain.
When free education arrived, people had to learn how to cope with mixed ability. When I was in secondary school, people didn't waste their money sending children to secondary school unless they were reasonably able, especially if they were girls.
Some of the girls who were thinking of teaching went to the nun who taught Irish to ask her what would they do about having to take an oath of allegiance to the Queen when they became teachers. And she said, "Always remember, girls, your country is Ireland and your Queen is Mary. So you will be taking an oath of allegiance to your Queen and country."
Perfect.
Very powerful voices there, Brendan Walsh. This is Brendan who's working on an oral history of secondary school teaching. How important or how dominant was that gender aspect, or maybe even a feminist aspect?
A lot of those, I love that last anecdote because that teacher was working in Belfast at that time, Dominicans in Belfast. But I found it's really interesting in the context of the conversation we're having at the moment, because a lot of the women I've interviewed, and I have to say they've nearly all been women because they're volunteering. I've only had 3 or 4 men out of 21 interviews.
Did that surprise you?
It did surprise me, yeah. What surprised me, I think, that men were less inclined to get in touch and be interviewed. I'm sort of, I don't want to put my foot on a bombshell here. I don't know why that is. It's voluntary.
He's looking at me.
I know. I just put it out there, and I'm hoping people will come and talk to me. But the women were really, really interesting. I mean, from the point of view of the 60s and becoming radicalised and so on, what I mentioned earlier on, I can't name any schools or people because that's the ethics of the research. But from one of the schools closing in Dublin, and the female teachers beginning to realise, hang on, we've no rights here. We don't have terms of contract. Becoming involved in the ASTI, then one went on to become president of the ASTI. So I think the issue of being a female is important. But just to hitch it on to what we were saying earlier on, I have to say, in fairness to the research, that a lot of these women are thankful to the nuns that taught them.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this from the point of view of the research that I'm getting. They speak. One of them uses the word proto-feminist. Others use the term feminist because they say the women were learned, they were independent. What you said a minute ago, Joe, they got them into debates. Yeah. The minister, I can use her name because she's the minister at the time. Niamh Branagh said to me, she said, that was, apart from home, that's what instigated her radicalism.
Which is a vital point when we talk again about balance and the idea that the church, because of what it's been through in recent times and its role in education, mightn't perceive the balanced treatment it needs. Is that part of your project?
I do. Well, it wasn't at the beginning, Dermot, and now I'm kind of almost sorry I didn't go and record these sort of dying voices of the religious because they're going. But I was really taken by the amount that people talked about what the religious had done for them, like you're talking about the brothers earlier on, Joe, and so on.
And also the role modelling.
The role modelling as well.
The role modelling is really significant.
For balance there, one of the people you heard talking about the rumbling of violence, that was a school where there was abuse, abuse, sexual abuse of children. He knew nothing about it. It came back later on. So just, from the point of view of balance.
Well, okay, unfortunately we're running out of time now,
Yeah.
and obviously Brendan is looking for help with this, and if you'd like to talk to Brendan for his oral history project, you'll find his contact details on our website, and while you're there, of course, you can also podcast this evening's programme. That's all we've time for. Many thanks to my guest, Minister Rory Quinn, Niamh Harrigan, Joe O'Toole and Brendan Walsh. Very briefly before we leave, two small things. A competition that's being run by the history website Pew's Occurrences, that's P-U-E-S Occurrences, to enter summarise your favourite century in Irish history in 115 characters or less. The winning entries will be read out on the programme, and they'll gain a place on a special tour of the roof and tower of St Patrick's Cathedral.